A very warm welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Frauke Thies. I'm Europe Director for Agora, and I have the pleasure to welcome you here at our event on planning Europe's energy infrastructure that we at Agora have organized together with our think tank partners from ECHO, EPG, Forum Energie, and IDRI. And it's great to see so many of you, and especially so many experts of you in the room. And I think just the fact that we're gathering here with so many of us at the moment shows how the whole question of infrastructure has moved from being a very technical backstage topic to really taking center stage in the European energy debates. And I guess it's not because it's the most glamorous of all topics, even though I assume that there are people here in the room who would argue that a well-designed grid map is a thing of beauty, and I see some very much associating with that. But it is because we've reached a point where Europe's energy policy ambitions, where the transition very much hinges upon the energy infrastructure and how much of it we can build, expand, and modernize to be up for the challenges of the transition, whichever perspective and political motivation we come from and look at it from. And with this event, we've designed the agenda to really help us take a step back and look at the bigger picture, but then also dive into what needs to happen. And we've structured it very simply around the three core questions: the why, the what, and the how. So we'll start first with a keynote session of what spotlight interventions, we called it, looking at the why this focus on energy infrastructure now, looking at it from the perspective of the transition, climate, economics and competitiveness, as well as security, to really give us the rounded picture why we need to move forward now. Then we come to our first panel, looking into the what. What exactly needs to change in our current approach? What is missing today? And what opportunities, but also which challenges, do we have to deal with also in the context of the grids package the Commission tabled before the turn of the year. In this first panel, I should not forget, we will also get a small input presentation from Mario Rakwitz, one of the researchers and leading researcher of a big infrastructure modeling project that we've done, modeling an integrated approach to infrastructure, integrated across countries, integrated across sectors, with Fraunhofer, IEG and EASY, as well as Define, to basically reveal what can be achieved if we take such an integrated perspective. And to not steal the thunder, but you may have come across those numbers already. Basically, one of the main findings was that Europe could save between 560 and 750 billion euros by taking such an integrated perspective between now and 2050. Then we will go into a break, and we're envisaging an interactive break because three of our think tank partners will be hosting interactive sessions, full discussion exchange on topics that are essential for the success of the transition from a systems, from an infrastructure perspective through different geographical lenses. And after the break, we go into the how. So that's our second and final panel. How do we implement a new approach? How do we turn strategies and scenarios into actual infrastructure, real-world infrastructure that gets built on time, in the right places, and with public support? So yeah, this final panel very much about the question, how do we get from vision to execution? And then we're going to close the day with a reception to give us all a chance to digest, exchange on what we've discussed here in the conference room, and move things forward. So thanks a lot to all of you for being here, for bringing your curiosity, your expertise, and the willingness to spend the afternoon with us to delve into the ins and outs of energy infrastructure. And on that basis, let's begin. Let's begin with the why session. And we have a lineup of 4, I think, very exciting spotlight interventions. In the program, we have them in alphabetical order, but actually I would like to stick to that order because I think there is a certain logic when it comes to the perspectives that we're hearing, starting with the Commission who tabled the grids package, hearing an economic perspective from the IMF, a perspective that is coming very much with a security lens, and then concluding with Andrea Wechsler, who I think is going to give us a bit more of a holistic regulatory lens to it. Of course, everybody is going to have all lenses anyway, but that was a bit the thinking behind. And so let's start with our first speaker, Tom Howes, who is advisor on green transition and market regulation, advisor to the director, who couldn't be here today because of urgent other things. Well, there's a little bit going on in the energy field at the moment, but we're extremely glad to have you here, Tom. And I hand over to you to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Frauke. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, apologies from Lukas. We are running around rather a lot at the moment and addressing or trying to address energy prices. Grids is part of that, but I'll come to that in a moment. I guess the question of why, I mean, we've had grids policy for a while. We've had the 10E, we've had the financing connecting Europe together. Grids have played an important role in creating the European internal market in electricity and gas. So it's been there for quite some time. And it was part also of our narrative of the need to integrate renewables, part of the energy integration story. So grids has been there for quite some time in energy policy history, but we all made a pivot in energy policy about 4 or so years ago, where we, having been reassured that security of supply wasn't an issue and affordability wasn't an issue, it now is an issue, very much so. And so we've pivoted away from a core focus on sustainability to a broader focus with much more attention to competitiveness, affordability, and security of supply. And as part of that, you're probably familiar with it, we produced a Clean Industrial Deal, the Affordable Energy Action Plan, the Repower EU package. So we've made this pivot, and as part of that, we're saying, okay, we need to look at every part of the energy sector and see whether that's working as efficiently as possible. And when you look at energy prices, our classic approach to looking at energy prices is to break it down and say, okay, energy prices are made up of taxes and levies, of tariffs, and of supply costs. And when you look at those, you see that grids are everywhere. Obviously, in terms of tariffs, we know that we have an issue about what we're financing with our tariffs, whether we have a total cost approach or an operating cost approach or a capital cost approach. There's accounting issues which have a big impact on the asset that you're financing and therefore on the cost that you are passing on through your tariffs. Tariffs have another dimension in terms of how you structure them. Do you use them to give a locational signal? Do you have a time of day offer? Do you have dynamic tariff structures? So the financing aspect of grids feeds directly through into prices. On the supply side, I mentioned we need a better grids development to integrate renewables, so it's bringing in the supply that we need to carry on electrifying and decarbonizing. So grids play a role in that. And then the first thing we encounter is the connection problems. Whether that's supplier or demander these days, we have grid connection access problems. Again, the Commission's produced guidance on this, but these are fundamental issues. So grids play a role in how we supply and how we access our energy, on the financing aspect of it. And so it's an integral part of anything you want to do in the energy sector. So for us, that's the logic behind the grids package as it's come out. We need the grids we need everything to move faster than ever before. We said this first with the REPowerEU package, where we said, okay, to move away from fossil fuels, from price volatility in global markets, we want to develop what's European, and that means more renewables developed in Europe, more efficiency using the energy efficiency industry of Europe. And to drive that forward, we needed grids. So that was already with REPowerEU, and now we're basically saying even more, even faster. And even though the grids regime that we had was good, we liked the Connecting Europe facility, the 10E, that also needs to step up. So that's what the grids package is doing. We're looking at the planning aspect, we'll dive into that today, the planning aspect, the permitting aspect, the cost-benefit sharing aspect, and the connection aspect. These are critical in terms of accelerating the energy transition, and the grids package is taking each of these elements and, we think, improving them. We hope you think we're improving them. We would like the legislative package to be adopted as rapidly as possible. I think there are some parliamentarians here. We would love it if you could have an agreed position before the summer so that we could get into trilogues in the autumn and sign things off before the end of the year. We think that's a perfectly realistic timetable given the need and the urgency and the ambition. But I look forward to the discussion today to dive into these 4 different aspects, all of which are important in improving the way the grids are operating and developing on our energy policy goals. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. And indeed, it won't be long until we have the chance to hear from the parliamentarians on what they make of this. But before we go there, we take an economics perspective. And I would like to invite Kristina Kostial, who is Deputy Director at the IMF, at the International Monetary Fund, where she works on macroeconomic conditions that enable countries to invest in and also benefit from, of course, the infrastructure that drives long-term prosperity and resilience. And I think, Kristina, you've been involved in many works and areas around the topic. You just mentioned a new piece you're working on. You also worked on you're one of the main authors of the Data for a Greener World publication. So we very much look forward to hearing your take on this topic.
Thank you, Frauke, and good afternoon. Europe cannot afford a fragmented energy system with high prices, with high volatility, and that is vulnerable, has persistent vulnerabilities, particularly to external shocks. What Europe needs is a profound transformation of its energy system. Why? I think very easy answers. First, the recent events in the Middle East just show how exposed Europe is to energy supply disruptions and price shocks. And second, Europe has, when you look at Europe's growth, has lost competitiveness. And Europe's per capita growth at the early 2000s was about at par with that of the US. And as of now, it's lost 1/3 of that. And we at the IMF, we have long been arguing that the reason for this low productivity or lower productivity in Europe is that there is a need to go into a true single market. And energy is part of that story. And let me just go into the first chart here. Not a big surprise, but when you look at industrial energy prices in real terms, they've roughly doubled since 2000. As of 2023, they were 2 to 3 times higher than in the US and in China. And just to note that if ETS didn't exist, you would shave off some 10% of the price. Now, parts of the economy can adapt to higher energy prices, and we actually saw quite some efficiency gains after Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But for the energy-intense industries, this is more difficult. There's much less room to adjust. And what happens to them is lower production, lower value added, and that, of course, then has spillovers into the broader economy. Now, Europe's problem is not just these high average prices, but it's also a wide dispersion. So in some countries, energy prices are 3 times higher than in other European countries. And the reason for that is that electricity does not flow freely across borders. And basically, when you have local shortages, that leads to price hikes, and the cheaper electricity cannot reach consumers elsewhere. Now, Europe actually already has a good solution. And the solution is the energy transition toward renewables. And renewables, and you see that here on the right-hand side chart, the levelized prices, wind, solar in red, are really low. Expanding renewables, of course, reduces dependence on expensive fossil fuels. It lowers exposure to external shocks, and it brings down structural energy costs, and that is important for Europe's competitiveness. But as we know very well, renewables are unevenly distributed. South has a lot of sun, the north, the Atlantic, has a lot of wind, but the sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. And that is the reason to, if you want to fully unlock the benefits of the renewables transition, what Europe needs is a strong, integrated energy, electricity system with appropriate grid infrastructure and interconnectors. And I want to talk a little bit more about the interconnectors. And what you see in the first chart is that Europe's electricity system is increasingly congested. And basically, the bottlenecks between the periphery and the center have doubled in the past 5 years or so. And that leads to larger price differences and also to greater vulnerability to localized shocks. And our research shows, and that is in the right chart, that if you have interconnectors, the wholesale prices drops by about 5% on average in the receiving country. This example here is on the interconnection between the UK and Belgium, and you see quite clearly pre- and post-interconnector what it does to the prices. Now, some would say, oh, yeah, that's fine for the UK, but it's bad for the exporting country. Because the consumers might face higher prices because of the interconnection. But our research shows that this does not have to be the case, because even lower electricity price countries, they have shortages at times when the generation of renewables is low. And in this sense, the cross-border infrastructure is a nice insurance, because it does smooth fluctuations, it improves efficiency, and it also reduces the risk of large price spikes due to localized shocks. And it does it on both sides of the interconnection. Now, can Europe afford the energy transition? And that is the novel research Frauke has been referring to. The answer is yes, Europe can afford it. And I'll show that to you on the next chart. You see some adjustment costs in real GDP at the beginning, but you see in the longer term, actually, the energy transition is positive for GDP growth because it improves competition. Now, achieving the EU's climate targets, we estimate that the cost of additional green investment is about 1.3% per year. Now, when you take into account brown investment, that does not happen. The net cost is 1% of GDP a year. And these estimates, I should note, are lower than many of the other estimates you have seen, because it takes into account that there's an adjustment in the economy. There's the reallocation from green into brown investment, and firms and households are adjusting to higher prices, to the price signal and the policies. Now, usually in the past, this 1% of GDP, about half of that would come from the private sector. I think that's a safe assumption. And with that assumption, the fiscal implications are not overly dramatic. We talk about 0.5% of GDP, and you see that in the last chart. That could be more than covered by revenue from ETS1 and ETS2. And indeed, I think from our side, price signals, I said that earlier, are very important, and maintaining a predictable emission pricing is essential also for the private sector as the price signal, and to have that stability in their planning. And that leads me to the policy agenda, and very similar to what you've just heard from Tom. First, Europe needs faster expansion of its electricity grids and stronger interconnections. Transmission infrastructure is the backbone of an integrated electricity market and a prerequisite for an expansion of renewables. Second, planning needs to be more coordinated across countries. And when it is about decisions on renewable deployment, about storage or grid expansion, country by country, leads to inefficiencies and leads also to delays. And the Europeans proposed a grid package is very welcome, including also increasing the funding for infrastructure. Third, further progress may require a more comprehensive approach, and what we're really thinking about is an EU-wide blueprint together with institutions that can overcome barriers to the single market. And that can really help in the planning and in the investment across the continent so that this is aligned. So just in conclusion, unlocking the full benefits of Europe's energy transition requires building a strong energy backbone. And that is a modern infrastructure, and that is effective institutions to ensure that this is not a country-by-country system, but this is a system that works together. And this backbone will make Europe more resilient to shocks, and will also make Europe more competitive through lowering energy prices and through less volatility in energy markets. And thus, it will make Europe more competitive and it help Europe increase its growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for this, I find, very compelling economic contextualization of what we're talking about. And thanks in particular also for already giving us a glimpse of the upcoming work. I found the figures fascinating and very important, I think, for the next steps in our debate. Now, having heard a lot about the economic and investment perspective, let's go to our next speaker, Thomas Pellerin-Carlin, who is, of course, known to most of us in the room, I believe, French member of the European Parliament and member of the group of the Progressive Alliance of the Socialists and Democrats, who doesn't only bring the lens of his party, but is also known for his background in the military. So, Thomas, I assume and hope we will also get a security lens from you.
Thank you, Frauke. Thank you, everyone. As often in Brussels, where we start to discuss infrastructure in an energy context, we start discussing the electricity grid. So let me zoom out a little, because one needs to be reminded of the fact that still today our world, and including our European energy system, is very much centered on fossil fuels. 2/3 of the energy we consume today is not electricity, it's oil and gas. Energy, I mean, why do we talk about infrastructure? Because energy has always been part of the backbone of any modern human organization. Any modern military sits on an energy backbone. Any modern society and any modern industry sits also on that energy infrastructure backbone. So if we go in, let me make a military historian argument just for a second. A lot of people think that the Allies won World War II because of, I don't know, the landings in Normandy, where I'm from. If you have a clear strategic vision of what happened during World War II, it was won primarily as an energy war, because the Allies had access to 90% plus of global oil, while the people fighting with the Nazis had access to close to zero. And if you look time and again, at specific moment in German military thinking, For instance, in Fall Blau, 1942, or even the very last offensive that was done by the Nazis in January 1945. They did that in Western Hungary because they were close to a refinery. The Allies clearly understood that the way to win World War II was to attack the energy backbone. And so they did attack mostly the oil fields in Romania, and that is one of the key ways the war was won. This is something that the military knows. It's something that the civilians have tended to forget, since we did not have any, let's say, kinetic war on the European continent over the last 80 years, putting aside Yugoslavia there. Russia understands this. If there is one political elite that understands the critical dimension of energy, it is the Russian one. And when Russia tried time and again to destabilize Ukraine, they did that by weaponizing gas. They started, and this actually created some of the gas crises that we experienced as a European in 2006, 2009, 2014, not even talking about the most recent one. And Russia did attack the Ukrainian electricity grid through cyber means as soon as the Christmas of 2015, which was, at least in open source information, open source intelligence, the very first time that a state did attack an electricity grid to not only cut it, but to rewire the electricity flows inside the country. And since 2022, Russia has been attacking the energy infrastructure in Ukraine in a very kinetic manner, obviously the electricity grid, but more importantly, recently, the gas grid. And a lot of the Ukrainians who have been dying throughout the winter that we just had died as a result of the attacks on the gas grid and the impact that it had. Obviously, we also now live in a world where a lot of energy infrastructure is being destroyed as we speak. Not electricity, but oil and gas, mostly gas currently in Qatar, as well as in Iran. So I think it's important for us to start with that global picture and to understand where we want to go as European. The discussion that we are having currently on the electricity grids package seems to be kind of a business as usual approach to things, which is not necessarily problematic. But I think it's important to make sure that we inject a little bit of political vision in the technical discussion that we are having. So I'm just going to end on two key messages. The first thing is that we need to be clear about which energy system we want as Europeans. There is currently an ongoing debate in this. And just to tell you what happened in December, I always confuse the two dates, but there was one proposal on December 10th. It was the grids one on December 10th, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So on December 10th, the Commission told us we go for electrification. And on December 16th, on the automotive package, the Commission told us, we're going to slow down electrification because we need to consume more oil for hybrid cars, and we need also to have biofuels inside those same cars. And we are currently seeing actually a disconnect of those two debates, even in the European Parliament. What I fear is that if we don't have clarity of where we want to go, we're going to build electricity highways to nowhere. Because a lot of people in Brussels, we are recorded, so I'm not going to ask you the question, but when I'm not recording, I'm asking the audience to raise their arm to tell me if they think electricity demand has been increasing or decreasing since 2019. And let's say that there is still a learning curve for people inside the Euro bubble to answer that question correctly. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we consume less electricity today than we did in 2019. So electrification is happening in Brussels speeches, but it's not happening in the economy. There has been actually a greater uptake of electrification in the US in 2025 than in the EU in 2025. So that's something we need to look at. Do we want more electricity? Actually, there are mixed voices there. There are a lot of people that have what I would call a fossil fuel nostalgia. Some people are nostalgic for the internal combustion engine. Some people are nostalgic for gas boilers. You can think of recent decisions by key member states that go towards that direction, for instance. People would choose fossil fuel nostalgia. Like, if you choose fossil fuel nostalgia, you need to draw the consequence and the geopolitical consequence of this. If you choose fossil fuels as a key element of the energy system for Europe's future, you need someone to provide those fossil fuels, and that someone cannot be Europe, because of geology, does not have access to fossil fuels. Therefore, when AfD the far right in Germany or when Jordan Bardella in France are praising fossil fuel nostalgia, at least they are being coherent. Because their political project is to enslave European freedom and choose a foreign master that is fossil fuel rich, either Vladimir Putin or Trump, or maybe both. At least it's coherent. The people that want European freedom and fossil fuel nostalgia at the same time are contradicting themselves. So therefore, what I will suggest as a political vision, drawing on the work that has been done by Adam Thies, is to say that the project for Europe is to become an electro-democracy. We have petro-states in the world. Iran is a petro-dictatorship. We need to be the opposite of that. And so therefore, the term electro-democracy is one I would suggest as the contradiction, or rather the opposite, of the petro-monarchy or the petro-dictatorships that are currently waging war in a part of the world. I want to end on something very practical that can be done, because obviously the macro political vision is great, but we need to make sure, as Jacques Delors used to say, that we articulate the political vision, the heart, with the screwdriver, the very specific public policy that we can do now. And what can we do now when petrol prices are more than €2 a litre for the working women that are the caretakers? I'm talking about people who earn minimum wage, slightly more, vast majority of them women, and a lot of you know some of them. They're the ones taking care of your grandparents or your parents when they're dependent. They're the ones taking care of our children. Where I'm from, in Normandy, those people rely on a car. They will drive 80, 100, 120 kilometers per day. And the increase of the cost that we've had already makes them pay 20 to 30 euros more per month for gasoline. 20 to 30 euros per month for those people is a lot. It's the difference between having the seawater there and the seawater there. It's the difference between living okay and starting to live in misery. What can we do for them? We can free them from their oil dependence by doing a European social leasing scheme for battery electric cars. We can do that today. We can put 10 million of those cars on the road in the next 5 years, and we can make sure, working with the member states, that those cars go to the people that most absolutely need that. And to me, that would be a concrete example of that choice for electro-democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for another very compelling case, even if from a very different direction than the previous one, the security one, but also landing us on, I think, what is again a combined economic and European freedom example. Our final speaker for this session is Andrea Wechsler, MEP from Germany, and I think equally known to many here, because I think especially in this field, a very known face in Brussels, member of the European People's Party. And Andrea Wechsler, you are working on the intersection really of competitiveness, energy, innovation, and in the end of the day, the regulatory frameworks that are needed to make this transition happen, to make it a success. So we very much look forward to your perspective, possibly bringing us all together with the different dimensions we've heard so far.
Ms. Thies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me today at this very timely discussion, an important discussion. And when you were saying, well, we'll expect a very formalistic regulatory perspective from Andrea Wechsler, I was thinking, well, maybe it's a bit more visionary. Maybe it's a little bit more also responding to what Thomas has said, because I spent the weekend in Barcelona discussing what Europe we want to live in, what is at stake at Europe, and what the role for energy basically is in the Europe we want to sit in. And we discuss a lot about Euro democracy. My vision is slightly different, but we will come to this in a minute. So let's be honest. When we talk about energy, it's not just about the question of infrastructure. It's about the question of the pensioner. And Thomas already said it, the women that take care, the men that take care of other people. It's the pensioner who turns down the heating because he cannot afford it, and the bill has become unpredictable. it's the family that starts to question the mobility back home and energy, whether it remains affordable. And it is. And I'm coming also from an area which is very rural. It's also the skilled worker in an industrial region who knows that if energy costs remain too high, the next investments will not be made in Europe, but elsewhere. And this is not abstract. This is what we see in Europe, where millions of people are affected by high energy prices. Nearly 1 in 10 Europeans cannot adequately heat their homes. And this is not a marginal issue, it's a warning sign. And let me be very clear, the question of energy infrastructure is a question of Europe's survival. We've heard the perspective of the geopolitical energy war by Thomas so far, but it's not just because of geopolitics, but it's something even more immediate, because it's of energy prices for our citizens and our industry. And if we lose control over both, we do just not lose competitiveness, but we lose the trust in Europe itself. And let me be very honest, it's now a year since we've seen the Affordable Energy Action Plan by the Commission. But when I'm back home in my constituency, energy prices are rising. People don't see the effect of European policies. And that's the realities in our constituencies that we face. We know we are under pressure right now. From a geopolitical perspective, and just the last couple of weeks have shown how quickly energy prices react to global instability. We are under pressure structurally, and we've already had it also in the discussion that were by Kristina. Electricity prices across Europe differ massively. And that's where we see that the single market is not yet working, and we do need the interconnectors just very urgently. And this is fragmentation. And the third pressure that we face is industrial pressures. Companies are taking decisions. They're not waiting for us to negotiate the grids package. They're making their decisions. Steel investments are being cancelled. Chemical companies are cutting costs and shifting production. And not because we lack ambition, we're discussing here in Brussels, but because energy is too expensive and it's too uncertain when the changes will come. And this is where the real danger lies. If energy remains expensive, industry will relocate, value chains will weaken, and investments will move elsewhere. And at the same time, households will see increasing costs, and the acceptance for the energy transition back home with the people will massively decline. And if both of this happen simultaneously, industrial crisis and trust by the people that's lacking, we will not only face an economic problem for Europe, but we will face a political problem. Because people will no longer experience the transition as progress, but as loss. Loss of affordability, loss of stability, and loss of consequences. And this is why an increased focus on infrastructure, to come to the why question, is so important now. Because that's where all the pressures meet. That's where geopolitics become prices, and that's where prices become industrial decisions. And that is where industrial decline becomes political instability, and that is why infrastructure is not a technical issue. It is the backbone of Europe's economic and democratic resilience. But there is a second problem, and Thomas has hinted at this problem in his speech, even though in a slightly different manner than I would argue for it. We are still thinking about infrastructure way too narrow. Too often the debate focuses almost exclusively on electricity grids, and we've seen it today as well. But Europe's energy system is not one-dimensional. And from a resilience perspective, it should not be one-dimensional. If we are serious about competitiveness and decarbonization, we must think in terms of a fully integrated energy system and not just an electricity system. And that means electricity grids, but also hydrogen infrastructure. It means storage and flexibility, and it means cross-sector integration. And yes, it also means openness for molecules. Let me be very clear on hydrogen on this point. Hydrogen will not be built through strategies, and we know we are all waiting for the hydrogen strategy here in Brussels. It will be built through infrastructure, pipelines, storage, import terminals, cross-border networks. And today we are repeating the same mistake: fragmented planning, slow permitting, regulatory uncertainty. And if we fail to build the hydrogen infrastructure in parallel to electricity, we will create an incomplete system, more expensive, less efficient, and less competitive. So across all of this, one issue remains very central. Europe does not lack targets and strategies. Europe lacks delivery. And the key constraint is well known. One of them is permitting. Today, infrastructure projects take too long. They face fragmented procedures and are delayed by political complexity. And that's not a technical failure. It's not a technical issue. It's a governance failure. And that's why I'm very glad that we now have the grids package on board. And Mr. House, I've heard you in terms of speed and be trustful. I've already pushed for a more ambitious timeline in Parliament because I really think this is such a clear win that we could do for the European people that we shouldn't push it towards the fall. And it would be really important to have a clear line before summer. So speed is important. It's one of the most important elements we need. We need enforceable deadlines, real one-stop shops early, administrative capacity, because time to build determines competitiveness. And if you look at the grids package, if you only negotiate it to the end until the end of this year, and then we have an implementation until it comes into force over another 2 years. So it's 3 years from now that we would see effects on the ground. That's not the speed that Europe reads now. Secondly, and we've heard that in Kristina's presentation, European infrastructure must be treated as European. Cross-border grids and hydrogen networks are not national projects. They are European strategic assets, and they must be planned and financed accordingly. And third, and maybe I'm taking over the IMF role here, investment stability. Infrastructure requires capital. Capital requires predictability. And our problem today is not lack of regulation. It's often too complex, too little certainty, and the priority must be implement what we have agreed before adding new layers. So let me conclude with one clear message. Infrastructure is where Europe's future will be decided. If we get this right and fast, we can stabilize prices, protect our industry, and strengthen our strategic autonomy, the Euro democracy. Fine if we get there. But if we get it wrong, we don't just lose competitiveness, we lose public trust, and we weaken Europe itself. So the task is clear. We need to think systemically, act decisively, and deliver fast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea Wechsler, and indeed for bringing in another dimension, and that is the affordability and the trust dimension in the whole story. You also went into the question, is it all electricity? What role is there for hydrogen? How can we think all of this together? Which I think is a very nice segue into our next session, and that is after having heard, I think, a very compelling case on why we are discussing this, why we are all doing this, why we need to speed up on infrastructure. We're now going to look into the what. What is it that we're talking about? What is it that we need? And for that part, I'm very glad to hand over to Sam Morgan from Foresight. Many of you will know him not only through podcasts. Sam, over to you to lead us through the rest of the afternoon.
Frauke. I hope everyone can hear me. Whenever I'm wearing a headset like this, I feel like I should be directing air traffic, but instead I will be attempting to direct the next two panels, because as Frauke said, we've heard the why. Shortly we'll be hearing the what, and then we'll be hearing the how. Firstly, Frauke, thank you so much for contextualizing what everyone had to say. I think that was really useful to be the aperitif for what we're talking about here as well. So firstly, I'd like to invite the panelists who we've got here. So Mario, Jose, Casper, Frauke, and Bram to join us up here. And then I'll introduce you, of course, and we can get started. Yeah. Did you want to be here, or do you want to sit here? As you wish. Okay. Great. Brilliant, thank you all of you. You have your microphones, your pens, your pads, your water, all of the event paraphernalia that we're accustomed to here in Brussels. Thank you all for joining us here. To get started into the what straight away, shall we? Mario, I understand that you have a short little presentation for us to kind of set the scene, I suppose. If you'd rather sit down or stand up, as you wish. What do you?
Stand up.
Sure. Talk us through what we should get into here over the next hour or so, I suppose.
Yes, thanks first of all for the opportunity to present the main outcomes of our study we did on behalf of Agora during the last 2 years, actually. And the key aspect was really to bring a systematic view into infrastructure planning and really have the integration across sectors and across member states. I don't know whether the slides are already uploaded or, so probably most of you or some of you have seen the results already in the main report that we that we presented, and therefore I would just like to give you the key essence of the scenarios that we have modeled and also the results. I don't want to bother you with the technical details. We modeled Europe in a multi-energy system integrated modeling tool, PIPES-A Eurosec, and this model allows to integrate actually generation, infrastructures, and demand across all sectors, in particular electricity, natural gas, hydrogen, and we also included CO2 infrastructures, and we actually differentiated between two main dimensions. One is the European integration, and the other one is the sectoral integration. And with respect to European integration, one extreme could be the current more member state-centric view that member states want to fulfill certain self-sufficiency targets in terms of generation in the future, so share of electricity, domestic electricity generation, and also domestic hydrogen production, where we assumed, as you can see there, in 2030, 80% self-sufficiency targets at the member state level, and for hydrogen, 70%. And in the European optimization, non-such self-sufficiency targets exist, but you have really a fully European optimization of the system. And on the sectoral level, we assumed that, again, on the in the cross-sectoral dimension, you have a free grid expansion across the different infrastructures, electricity, hydrogen, CO2, natural gas. And in the sectoral optimization, we oriented our modeling based on the current TYNDP planning and set that as a constraint until 2040, and then let the model optimize the system towards 2050. And within these 4 dimensions, we also, of course, calculated different scenarios, but these were the key elements, and I jumped directly to the main results in terms of infrastructure. And we see the electricity grid on the upper left corner, and methane grid, and hydrogen and CO2. And a key output was that we have a massive expansion of electricity transmission grids across the EU. We do see that, of course, also in the TYNDPs, but particularly interconnections between countries have been or are higher in the European integration and cross-sectoral integration than at the national sectoral perspective. We also see a significant hydrogen transport grid for the supply, in particular, of industrial demand centers. And compared to the European hydrogen map that was already presented, we see actually a more diverse and more meshed grid, but with lower transport capacities than in the current proposals. And we see also a strong decrease in natural gas capacities. And with respect to the CO2 grid, we actually observed that we see that a local transport system emerges which connects the demand centers and the supply points or the point sources for CO2, but we don't really see a meshed CO2 grid across Europe. That was also somewhat surprising for us. We rather see point-to-point connections for CO2. Some of the main results regarding the cost savings might be already known to you from the main reports. In particular, Commissioner Jorgensen very prominently also cited the figure of 560 billion euro total savings in terms of total system costs between the cross-sectoral European dimension and the national sectoral dimension. And this is mainly due to the fact that we need less generation capacity, less backup capacity, and have a more efficient grid expansion within the European cross-sectoral dimension. And therefore, in overall terms, we save investments of about 506 billion euros in the generation assets and about 170 billion euros in infrastructures, and have also savings in fuel costs. Summarizing the results, the overall results of the study, we see, first of all, you see on the left-hand side, the demand and supply dimensions in the bar chart, that we see a strong electrification across sectors. Of course, particular mobility, but also industry will be highly electrified. We see that European hydrogen production requires increased electricity demand, and also that will be a key demand for electricity, for additional electricity generation, about 2,000 terawatt hours. And we see that a significant demand for basic industry, particularly steel industry, also chemical industry, and synthetic fuels for hydrogen demand. Regarding infrastructure and the asset development, we see that we have major savings in the European integration scenario due to the fact that we have a decrease of generation capacities and conversion assets like electrolyzers in the European integration and in the cross-sectoral integration. The integrated scenarios also lead to increased interconnection capacity between member states. So interconnection is really a key element for a stronger European picture. And we see that cross-sectoral integration across, so better integration across sectors, electricity, hydrogen, natural gas, leads to a reduced hydrogen transport capacity, although we have a widely matched grid, and an increase in hydrogen storage capacity. Overall, I already mentioned the 560 billion euro in terms of savings in the fully integrated scenario in overall total system costs, and infrastructure investments that are reduced by about 160 billion euro due to integration. So integration holds large benefits for Europe, and therefore I'm very happy that we are talking about the grids package and the opportunities to stronger integrate the planning of infrastructures and also generation assets across Europe. Thanks.
Mario, thank you so much for the thank you so much for the details there. I'm always struck by numbers, and I always try to contextualize them as best as possible for, you know, as a journalist. And the fact that the savings and the investment reductions that you mentioned there are near or thereabouts the same amount of money that the European Union had to borrow for the COVID Resilience Fund, for example, I think that puts it into perspective when you can, put those numbers together. For our first sort of round of questions for you, the panelists here, as you said, Frauke, this is the what. We need to talk about the what here. And it's the 23rd of March, correct me if I'm wrong. The way things stand at the moment, what needs to change? We heard about the why and the extremely compelling reasons why the system that we have needs to change. But what is it that we need to take seriously now? Use the grid package as obviously an opportunity to do that and a vector to do that. But what is it that needs to change? And maybe, Jose, we could start off with you. And I didn't introduce you, but you're the energy attaché, obviously, for Portugal's permanent representative. It was a time-saving measure on my part, which I'm now wasting. But your perspective on the what here. What is the detail of the what?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me tell you on the what, please. Nothing more. Today we had this interview from Mr. Fatih Birol where he said something like, well, we're basically witnessing 2 oil shocks and Ukraine at the same time. So no more, what do we need to bring the attention? We're done, okay, we don't need anything else to bring the attention to this. What we need is to understand that we cannot waste any time. And we have to go forward, and to go forward in, I would not say an unified way, but a common way, a consensual way of us pulling all the strings together. We need to make this jump of looking at the national plans rather than national plans, but as building blocks of something bigger. And this is a jump that we need to take. I don't think it's about the technology, the money, the will. It's this jump that we need to take this leap as a whole. We know that each member state has its own challenges, its geographical position, the way it is organized. We know all of that, but we need to take this leap. And this is what I would like to bring the attention here. This is where I think that I would like for everybody to have their attention, having this common view where, in fact, this is not giving up sovereignty or anything like that. It's, in fact, enhancing the sovereignty, and rather than just 27 sovereignties, 27 energy sovereignties, having a single shared energy sovereignty. And that would be the biggest takeaway I would like to leave here in terms of what we need to draw attention to. Okay.
And do you see the grids package as taking us some way towards that?
We have a very, I can only say on Portugal's behalf, we have a very positive view on the grids package. I think it brings the European dimension that is required from our stance. We, of course, there are details. You can ask for more this or more that in this discussion about centralized and coordination. Actually, I did a word count. It's not brilliant metrics, but I did a word count, and centralized or central appears 65 times. Coordination or similar occurs 55 times. So it's not a brilliant metric, but it says that we're trying to get a balance between what is common, what is a scenario that everybody can and somehow see themselves mirrored into, and at the same time ensuring that the coordination between member states is there. Of course, there are details. There is this thing that even in Portugal we don't like this and we don't like that, but that's why we are discussing, and it's all, we shouldn't make a drama. It's part of the process. Okay.
Speaking of word counts and word metrics and things, we've produced more than 500 episodes of our podcast, and at one point we would put 50 cents in a jar every time we mentioned grids, because we didn't want to mention it every single time, but we quickly suspended that policy. Exactly, yeah. Very expensive Christmas party. Moving on, Casper, you're a research analyst at the EU Institute of Security Studies. Welcome as well, of course. Your perspective on the what. Now you've heard the why and the member state and the details. What's your view on this?
Is the usual. Does this work?
Yes.
All of the above is the usual answer. Faster, more, better, right? That's the usual, that's the easy things. But maybe the slight added value maybe onto this panel is to then pick up maybe something that Thomas mentioned as well, is in the context of the physical security side and looking at this in terms of, I don't know, like the meshed infrastructure and a way of building an infrastructure, and that is also then, again, talk about word count, security features 22 times, and was it? But then the interesting things is then what does that boil down to, and what does that boil down to? And it's, I think one of the important terms here is always resilience by design. How do you build a system that then actually can deal with again, looking at the why, looking at the context of what we're in, and so how do you do that better, and how do you plan that better, and how do you additional to that? And so I think this is unfortunately another level on top of it. But if done well, hopefully will combine with the stuff that you're outlining in this report, but also other alternative reports, particularly in offshore infrastructure. And how do you construct it in a way that makes it more resilient often through redundancies, often through better ways of doing it and better planning, but equally the physical security of the infrastructure, which does require then also different considerations and different views. But I think the main thing is now, more, better.
There's a few songs with that kind of those lyrics to them, aren't there? Maybe just moving just over you, Frauke, because we heard from you a little bit, and we'll come back to you for sort of a wrap up from this first round. Bram, your kind of view then, I suppose, on the grids package. Does it give the opportunity to achieve some of these things that we want to change? Is there enough there, or do we need? Is there not enough there? Do we need something else? Do we need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to what is on the table with the grids package? What's your kind of view on whether we can achieve this what that we want to get to?
Well, that's a very big question and a very good one as well. Of course, the grids package, I think, takes important steps forward for sure. And we had a very robust planning framework in Europe to plan electricity and gas infrastructure and moving towards new energy carriers. And I think for us as a community of energy regulators, it's really important to do that in a way that respects the role of markets, is well regulated, is leading to affordable consumer prices, and supports the energy transition and the integration of renewables. We've heard a few times here already today that prices are strikingly different between countries in Europe, which is due to all kinds of things, but tells you one thing, that there is a big opportunity there for welfare gains to better connect those countries. That's one. But there's also, and we haven't talked much about that, very big price differences within a day, within a country. Only last week, in the middle of this developing energy crisis, in France, we've seen prolonged periods of €0 per megawatt hour electricity prices, which tells you there's an important opportunity there as well. And so I think the grids package, in reinforcing the scrutiny of the plans, building them from the bottom up, but reinforcing the role that ACER and regulators can play in verifying data that is being used, is a really good way forward. It's really important for public trust, and especially to make sure that we don't, because we can't afford to make too many mistakes. We will make mistakes, but we shouldn't make too many mistakes, because mistakes in infrastructure build-out tend to be very expensive. And so if we look at, for example, the important role that hydrogen has to play, we also see that there's many insecurities still there. So it's really important to try to get it as good as possible, as correct as possible, and avoid that we build projects that then turn up to be sunk costs. Or, in the middle of this fossil fuel crisis, make sure that we use as many alternatives to fossil fuels that we have, using those price differences within a day. And so making sure that any non-wire solutions that we have, and non-wire solutions in the broad sense, that we have to mitigate the need for expansion of infrastructure is a really good one, because it saves cost for infrastructure. I mean, the data that was presented shows that very clearly. We save on infrastructure costs, but also on operational costs. Less fossil fuels that are needed to produce the energy that we all need. So yeah, I think it puts important steps forward. We of course have some remarks on the details of the package, but it is definitely taking important steps forward.
You mentioned we might make mistakes, but we can't afford to make too many of them, Bram. And I suppose when you look on even an individual level when it comes to the energy transition, or should I buy an electric car yet? Will I be able to charge it where I want to go? Will the heat pump heat my particular kind of house? There is this fear of failure to an extent. how do you think that translates into this wider system planning? You know, is this fear of failure, you think, something we need to get over, or we need to, you know, keep a certain amount of risk assessment in what we're doing? How cautious do we need to be?
Well, I mean, I think we need to be cautious for sure. It would be surprising if I would say something different. No, what that translates to, I think, concretely in the grids package, if I may, is there's a strong focus on having central scenario, which is great. I mean, the word count says it. And that's, we fully support that. But I do think it's important to make sure that that central scenario is a good reference, to make sure that there's sufficient sensitivities, alternative scenarios, to test that central scenario, to make sure that ultimately the infrastructure projects that get selected based on the scenarios are as surely needed as we can imagine, or as we can get them. And so I think there's ways to improve the current approach there.
I'm moving to you now, Frauke. You've heard a fair amount of what here, and obviously with the why that we had before. Do those two things tally together with you? With, you know, have we covered all the what, or is there something extra you think that we could add here?
Thanks. And indeed, I think a lot of the what has been covered. And frankly, the Commission has also covered a lot of the what already, a lot of the measures going in the right direction, as José also pointed out. I think a more coordinated approach, the central scenario, Bram, that you also mentioned. Overall, a stronger focus on electricity grids, very important. Anticipatory investment, another important part. Generally, the acceleration of the whole process, especially the permitting, but also enhanced regional cooperation. A lot of very important good elements in there. I would like to come back on the point of caution, because I think that's a very interesting one. And also the modeling work can tell us quite a lot about it. I very much agree with your point, Bram, that especially for such scenarios to serve as guidance for planning, we should have various sensitivities and look at those. We've calculated some in the model, but we're also proposing that any such approach should be as transparent as possible, should ideally be an open source approach to allow for various scenarios, various sensitivities to be taken into consideration, looked at, compared, to see what the common emerging trends are. But even on the basis of the runs that we've done, we get some pretty solid indications. And one of them is that electricity grids are, even with the most ambitious assumptions taken forward in the TYNDP process, still on the lower end. We need more. We tend to underestimate what it is that we need. So yes, caution, but for elements where we have a lot of certainty that we need them, the approach of anticipatory investments, of moving forward, is, I would even argue, treading on the side of caution, because the risk of not having these investments, of having them too late, is a lot higher for the economy than potentially having a grid here or there that is, in the first instance, not utilized at the fullest capacity. So caution can also mean going for anticipatory investments in fields where we know that at some point we are going to use them, and the risk of non-investment can be higher than the risk of investment. On the other hand, the calculations also show us that we tend to, and Mario has made the case, that we tend to see, even with what I would say very balanced, you could even say on the kind of higher and conservative end assumptions on how much gas and hydrogen are going to be used, certainly in the context of the current crisis situation that is still very much unfolding. But even if you take these assumptions, the planned gas capacity, the planned hydrogen capacity tends to be overestimated. So even if we go for ambitious hydrogen scenarios, which we will need hydrogen, absolutely, but we may not need as much hydrogen infrastructure to use that hydrogen, because we will see it being used in clusters. We will be seeing industrial clusters with high demands, but that doesn't mean we need broad coverage across the entire continent. And so their caution means very much informed by scenarios, informed by knowledge, to see where do we need those investments and where are we rather running the risk of stranded assets. And that case is, of course, even stronger when we look at gas, where we are seriously running the risk not only of stranded assets, but also of costly lock-ins.
Thank you, Frauke. Before we move on to the next stage, I'm not the only one that can ask the questions here, of course. If any of you in the room have a burning question for any of our panelists, get it in mind already, and we'll have a little 5 minutes or so at the end. Anyone watching online or listening online, wherever you are as well, our team here will be able to take your questions as well and put them to the panel, so get them ready. And we have a question for you as well, the audience, from our Menti poll, which come up here anytime now, and some instructions with a QR code about how to access that. And it's basically, and you'll see now, it will ask you the things in the grid package that we need to maybe focus the most or get right, I suppose. And it's infrastructure planning, better permitting, or grid modernization. So yeah, scan the code. You've got half an hour or so to obviously vote, and we'll discuss the results at the end as well when we have some questions. But yeah, to move on to, fantastic. Thank you so much for already voting. You have no idea how many events that I've moderated where nobody bothered straight away, which was very, very disheartening. To move on to the next part, this idea of the central planning, which we've heard a lot about, and which people have a lot of different ideas about how it should be done. Maybe to start with you, Jose. Is this something that is really integral to getting results on this and to moving fastly, like you said in your answer before, and to get over this way, the business as usual that we've been doing things? Do you see this as the future, and do you see any challenges to doing central planning? You know, is a union of 27 countries, for example, too big to have central planning? You know, is that too much of an obstacle to overcome, or is it fundamental that we do and we just accept that this is what we need to do?
I think that we need to answer a fundamental question. How well are we committed to the Union of Energy? How well are we committed to a single market? How much do we want to establish an energy Schengen for kilowatt of hour of electricity? I am not able to answer by the 27, but I could say that Portugal, a peripheral state, member state, which has some of the lowest wholesale electricity markets, electricity price markets in Europe, even us, that we could be very happily in our corner with our low wholesale electricity price markets, we are deeply committed into seeing the energy union as a whole and willing to take our role into that. So I can talk on our behalf. But I think there is, again, this collective answer, and we need to 27 to give. Are we in fact committed with this? This is rhetorical. I think that we are within our national specificities, but in the end we have to deliver. Okay, so if there is a commitment, and if we have to deliver, from where I'm from, delivery is actually delivering, is making it a tangible thing for people, for companies, and it's kind of stressful to think that this is not still clear on everyone's minds. Okay.
I turn it to you, Mario, about the central planning topic, I suppose. You outlined obviously a lot of opportunities in your study, especially the investment reductions and the savings that we've made. Presumably continuing with this fragmentation of where we're going is totally toxic to a lot of that, right? And that's a future that we will not be able to realize unless we really do come together. So what is your view on the central planning aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the central planning aspect is so important in order to really gain the overall benefits, which are beyond just benefits of two countries building an interconnector. Of course, this we can already gain in today's infrastructure planning approach. However, if Portugal, for example, could be an exporter to Belgium indirectly via Spain and France, then that is or brings major benefits to the European customer and to the European energy system, makes it more robust and more efficient. And this would only be seen if we really look at this from a central point of view. And of course, we already in today's infrastructure planning approaches in TIBA and DP, in principle, we have the aim of this kind of central planning, however, or this central optimization, but it's not like when looking at the procedure, it's at the end a patchwork of member states' perspectives that is then patched together in the best way, but it's not starting from the overall optimization approach at the European level. And therefore, we can gain a lot from doing that in an optimized, co-optimized way across the different infrastructures and at the European level. And that was already emphasized by Draghi and Letter report, etc. And we have done the calculations, and these are the figures that we gain from that. And as you mentioned before, of course, there is, with this central planning, it has to remain agile on the one hand. So it's important to have this, from my point of view, this open source modeling approach where everyone can reproduce the results and question it, etc. And it needs to be transparent, as Frauke has already mentioned. And we have uncertainties in the system. For example, we don't know yet whether we will be able to keep all the basic industries in Europe, or whether we will import pre-products like sponge iron or so for the steel industry. And therefore, the overall planning approaches also have to adapt to that in a rolling fashion. And I think also that can be done in a very suitable way if, for example, like if a central actor like the European Commission continuously runs these scenarios, and many of these aspects, like how much hydrogen will we have within the next 5-10 years, are actually political decisions, because we'll only have as much hydrogen as we will have policy support for basic industries using hydrogen. And therefore, it's directly connected to policy decisions and financial support decisions, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to also integrate somehow these decisions with the central planning approaches in order to reduce the uncertainties for infrastructure decisions.
Mm-hmm. I've always liked the idea of Portuguese wind power in Finnish saunas, this real flow of energy. And I mean, you called it a patchwork there, Mario, and maybe turning to you, Bram. How do we move from this patchwork to a proper central planned system? And is it something that we can do? We're always arguing about everything, whether or not it's the Druzhba oil pipeline or GDPR or something in the EU. There's always something to argue about. Is this something that we can actually agree on to an extent where we get things done?
Well, I think it's going to be a combination, of course. I think it's really important to make sure that national realities are fully taken on board. We shouldn't think, and I don't think that's the idea, but to get granular enough information about what's happening in the countries, it's really important to have those national actors. In the first place, TSOs, of course, they have a lot of information on the electricity and gas sides. And then the national regulators and other stakeholders. So it's going to be, I think, has been mentioned, that I liked José's analogy of the building blocks. So it's you start bottom up, and of course make sure that there's consistency between the countries, especially, of course, for integrating across borders. I think it's also really important to assess on a regional level projects, having actors from different neighboring countries look at concrete proposals and assess which ones are realistic and less realistic. onshore, but definitely also for the important challenge of developing the offshore grid. I think it's going to be a combination. I think we shouldn't underestimate the task of actually gathering, and I'm sure that you're very well aware of that, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of gathering all the data and making sure that you have all that input and then running the models. It's not an easy task. And it's important to be able to do it in a transparent way. And so I like the suggestion that Frauke did for open source approach to this, also to enable regulators at the national, but also at the European level, important task for ACER there, to make sure that we can check what's going on. And also, which we haven't talked about yet, to ensure consistency between different important planning exercises. This is about infrastructure. We're doing similar exercises for adequacy, for flexibility. A lot of similarities there. We need to make sure that they are consistent. And that's going to be easier if it's transparent.
You had a quick point, and then Mario as well on this.
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, building on the point, Bram, that you made about the different levels that José made earlier as well, I think that the term centralized planning may even be taking it a step too far. Because what we're talking about is a centralized, integrated modeling approach as a guidance, but then, and I want to thank Emmeline in particular, the former Agora Europe director, for making the point also as we developed this work, making the distinction very clearly between a scenario does not mean planning. The scenario is the background, the guidance to the planning that's then happening. And of course, the planning needs to happen at different levels, informed by the calculations. And there will be certain things that will more directly emerge from European scenario building. The so-called highways that the Commission put forward, that's basically the stuff that needs to be determined at the European interconnected level. And then we go down from there. And the model serves as kind of, if you will, a North Star, something that then the planning will need to be measured against, and we will see, oh, why does it differ so much? And we can look into the reasons and probably end at a point that is sensible and informed by the planning. But again, I think scenario building does not mean centralized planning per se. It's a much more differentiated approach.
Language is everything. As a former translator, I totally endorse getting the word right from the beginning. Mario, what was your view on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to make the 2 points that a central scenario is not a central planning yet, but there's planning approaches behind that. And of course, I wanted to fully agree to Bram that we, of course, have to take into account the national perspective and also in our cross-sectoral European approach, we fully integrated the NECPs, etc., etc. So the national energy system planning, and we also integrated the already permitted and inbuilt projects from the T1DPs, etc., etc. So all this bottom-up information was fully considered, but then the model could optimize and comes up with the central scenario, which is not a central planning, as Frauke said.
Casper, turning to you now, the what of central scenarios, which I'll call from now. From your perspective, what are the things that this would need to most, diligently get right?
Yeah, well, obviously mostly agreed with the conversation that's gone before. So not huge amounts to add to that. I think that's exactly, you have to factor in the national things. But for me, it's about how, whether using this methodology or using this centralized view as a way of pushing things along a bit, right? Needs to all just move a bit further forward. But again, I think this is in theory, I think I don't want to remake your coordination point either, but obviously the problem with this stuff is it does mean that it forces something to be done that isn't necessarily done already or is done on a very fragmented level. Again, I think this is the discussion with the TSOs, is that how do you factor in certain things that different TSOs are thinking about different stuff, and how do they manage that on a European level or on a national level? I don't necessarily know what to add to this, but I think it's about bringing in as much as possible into a thing, and with the aim, again, I don't think to lose track of this, going into the scenarios, going into all this sort of stuff of how do you make it happen faster? Putting this again back into the why, bringing the why into the what, is the why was very clear, and that demands speed, and that demands some degree of clarity. Fine, again, there's always the discussion about energy mix, but some form of electrification is probably the answer, and then doing it as quickly as possible, and how best to enable that. And I suppose there's always a discussion between whether you want to do this centrally or whether you just enable people to do stuff, and that's going to enter into this whole discussion, but faster.
I promised to ask on the how panel shortly, how do we do this quicker, just so we can get there. Maybe if we turn to sort of some questions from somebody else for a change. My colleagues over there, is there anyone online that has a burning question for anyone on the panel at this point?
We have some questions online. I'm not sure whether you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. There are two questions on open source, which has been mentioned already. So the one question is, how specifically could open source tools be used for the development of the central scenario? And the second question is a bit in reverse. Are there any risks related to using open source tool with a view to assessing critical infrastructure? And the second question, maybe I summarize it quickly, relates to sharing costs benefits of grid investments across Europe, not only with a view to interconnections, but also domestic grids, and to what extent those can be also included in the grids package.
Anyone have a view on the open source point, I suppose, first of all? Yeah, Casper.
Very briefly, because I think this is something, again, that is always the slight clash of worlds, and I think is, again, bringing the why back into the what, is that this needs to be done in a way that is conscious of people are targeting the critical infrastructure. It can't be just available to anyone to look at, because then people know exactly what to go for and how to go for it, and what damage that would cause. I think there has to be a way in which this is done, maybe not in an open source way, but in a way that is constructive, but also to some extent has to understand that we're not in the post-1990 order anymore. There are actors trying to attack the system. So would be my slight contribution to that.
Maybe I think that the open source question, I've heard like two questions. First of all, how can that be done for a central scenario? And I think there are models already used by different actors, not only by the ENSOs, but also, for example, JRC, like the PipeSay model that we used is already employed by JRC, and could nicely be taken over also to model the central scenario. And by the way, the results of this study are fully openly published, so already today everyone who's interested can start to play and build his own central scenario. This is a neat feature from the study, and one could start. And this, for the second question, whether this brings any security concerns, I mean the coarsity of the grid is sufficiently coarse that I don't think that this serves as a tool for attacking infrastructure. You would use other maps for if you really want to attack infrastructures. I mean, due to the modeling constraints, etc., like the PipeSay model runs on about 350 nodes across Europe. But if you want to integrate everything and you have computational, or considering the computational resources needed for that, we had to limit ourselves to 64 nodes, and this is so coarse that I think no one would use that type of grid to really threaten European energy infrastructure. I'm I'm not a terrorist, but I would use different.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. Yeah. It was on the form you signed beforehand, but yeah. Were there any other views on the open source aspect of this, or was that covered sufficiently?
Just add, sorry, just not on the open source, but on the resilience and the importance of these interconnections. So, some of you may remember in early February we had this terrible, we call it the carousel of thunderstorms in Portugal. We have in central Portugal, the grid was practically wiped out, destroyed. Portugal was broken into electrically. So there was the communication between the north and the south. North, where we have lots of wind, lots of hydro, was very poor during a certain amount of period in the north and south of Portugal. How did we pull it off? With our Spanish friends. Okay? This meant some of our power went from the north to south of Portugal through Spain. This resilience is, I'm not saying it's taken into account in this exercise that we are discussing, but these interconnections, the physical infrastructure, and the management, the coordinated management between TSOs, this is a very practical example how this works and how solidarity actually works. Okay, so I want to take just a hint on the.
It's a practical example of what, unfortunately, we might have to get better used to, right? So, yeah, it's great to point that out, Jose. There was a second question in there as well, right, on cost sharing, domestic grids, etc. Bram, did you have something on that, or?
So I think the question was, correct me if I'm wrong, Kristina, that it was, can national planning be included in this European exercise, right? Is that the?
And whether specific domestic grid reinforcement investments could also be considered better or otherwise or differently in the cost-benefit sharing approaches that exist in Europe.
Yeah, and so I think this is, of course, a European infrastructure planning scenario and a planning exercise, identifying cross-border reinforcements that are needed. It's important that the modeling, I think, is done with sufficient granularity in the national grids. That being said, the planning of national infrastructure is a matter of national development plans, which is something done within the member states and overseen by national regulators. So we shouldn't mix those things up, and also avoid that some of the provisions around cost sharing isn't leading to kind of undesired effects on the way that bidding zones, for example, within countries are designed. One could think that member states might be tempted to redesign their bidding zones to avoid congestion income that then could be set aside for somebody else. Not to say that solidarity is not important, of course, it very much is, but we should make sure that congestion income can be used to resolve congestion that is leading to that congestion income or to lower cost for consumers. So I would keep things a bit apart there. It's really important within the national planning to have correct locational price information. Ideally, that also reaches the consumers. But to make the European planning exercise one that also defines national grid elements, I think that's probably too ambitious.
Thank you, online people, for your great questions. People in the room, of course. Gentleman there, if you could get a microphone over here. If you could introduce yourself, and if the question is for one person or specific or the entire panel, yeah, direct it appropriately.
Thanks very much. Chris Radziewski. I'm with the system operator in Great Britain, NISO. Frauke, like the point you made around modeling, we've been underestimating electricity grids for a while in terms of modeling. We've been overestimating the other ones, as you suggested, and also for a while, we continue to sort of bring those numbers down. Why do you think that's the case? And open to other panels to expand if we're modeling both of them, but we both seem to be off on the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Frauke first, and then if anybody else has some feedback as well.
I think the core of the question is what was the governance around the modeling and the mandates to do the modeling, and the way that it's done in Europe is, of course, there is an attempt to bring the modeling closer together in the TYNDP process, but essentially where we're coming from is a siloed perspective. We have the electricity TSOs modeling their grid, we have the gas TSOs modeling their grid, comparing notes and seeing what makes sense together. But of course, if you task gas TSOs to model a gas grid, that already defines a certain direction of travel. And this is exactly what we try to break with our integrated modeling approach, because what the pipes and model does is that it optimizes economically between the different sectors and what kind of infrastructure is required. And that's how we come to these results, showing that in electricity we should even go somewhat higher than what the TYNDP suggests, but quite significantly lower on gas and also hydrogen infrastructure than what the TYNDP suggests here. So that is, I think, part of the answer. It's really the governance around it. If I may, Sam, I would like to also take the opportunity to go into one dimension of the question that came online on the domestic infrastructure, because I think one question is how far should the model inform the planning? The way I heard the question, there was possibly also a dimension of cost-benefit sharing in it, in that we have, of course, a couple of transit countries in Europe, countries that, of course, need the infrastructure domestically, but that also need the infrastructure to, well, basically function as transit. And there, the answer is not easy, but I think the first message is that, and the modeling underpins that very much, an integrated infrastructure benefits everyone. And in the end of the day, when you look into the details of it, most member states tend to benefit from the integrated approach, irrespective of whether they're a transit country or not. But then, of course, there are some differences in some cases where the cost-benefit sharing does become important, and that's to be taken into consideration. That's where we have all the political challenges about now. But I think the core of the message to be borne in mind is the net benefit for everyone is so much bigger by making this joint effort in an interconnected system, that is what should guide the whole effort. And I think the first session very much gave us the reasons why that possibly even go beyond the individual short-term economic benefits for each and every country.
Mario, you had a comment on that. And if anyone has one more question, we'll have time in a moment, maybe.
Yeah, just a small addition to what Frauke said. I really think that with the grids package, we are really a major step forward with acknowledging the benefits of a more integrated perspective. What is now missing is really the calculus for the cost-benefit aspects. That is something that probably needs to spelled out in more detail. And I fully agree, for countries that are more transit countries, it would be beneficial to have a CBA mechanism that also remunerates them for their transit function in a way. And that is something that is not yet in the current Commission proposal fully spelled out, but can be an important next further step.
Potentially a topic we can get into, the how as well. I'll add it to the list of how to go quicker. We have time for one question. The gentleman there, I saw you first. So again, if you could say who you are and who you'd like to address it to.
Pleasure. My name is Anton and I represent the Adani Group. Looking at the same problem where other countries have been already or are currently, about the what. The joining the dots with other sectors as opposed to taking a siloed approach to grids. So for example, how do you start to phase out subsidies to fossil fuels to be able to distinguish between price and cost? How do you actually ramp up nuclear? How do we look at the minerals implications of domestic grids, of various parts of the grids? And then, of course, the generated AI. So with regards to the what I'm suggesting here, is there a scope for a more joined up approach with things that are outside the grid silo? Thank you.
I suppose for the entire panel, in that case, anyone who has a view on this? Anybody before we wrap up the session? I'll pick one of you if you don't. Bram.
I mean, if I understood the question correctly, it's really important to have realistic assumptions around the evolution of demand and resources that need to connect to the grid. And there, it's important to be able to cross-check, validate the input data going into the scenarios, which I think, frankly speaking, is one of the important areas for improvement compared to the current approach, for all kinds of good reasons, but making that more robust to have a more realistic assumption and also more locationally granular assumption around demand evolutions, as well as generation and flexibility resources that are present or are going to be present in the grids, is just going to make the resulting identified projects more robust, I think.
Fantastic. We've unfortunately come towards the end of our what panel here. I think we've very comprehensively got into the what and also set the scene for the next panel, which is the how, which hopefully we'll be able to address some things. Before I tell you all about the coffee break, which will be slightly different to your usual coffee breaks, if we could have a look at the poll maybe, which has been running in the background. Infrastructure planning. I did suspect that would win out, but a certain amount of support for better permitting and grid modernization. Obviously, it's all three, but maybe a quick show of hands from our panel. Which of you agree with the infrastructure planning side? None of you? One, okay. Interesting. You split your vote. You agree with all of them, okay. Brilliant. Thank you all for voting.
This is not sorry. Thanks. It's not a necessarily uniform picture all over the EU. In some places, permitting may be the major issue, and others it may be planning, and others we have very old infrastructure. We have so we have to, when you look at this, it's like a picture that can scrap local realities. Okay.
So we did the what earlier, as you'll all know that we're here. We're moving on to the how now of how we do this, which as a journalist, I suppose, is sometimes the most important and intriguing part of energy transition topics. And we'll get into whether or not that's true or not. So if I could ask my panelists to come up here and I'll introduce you and we'll get into this topic, if that's good. So Maxime, Robert, Paul, Pamela, if you could join me up here. Fantastic. Thank you to all of you that have come back for this second panel. I hope you really enjoyed the coffee breaks as well and learned something extra about the specific examples that our colleagues were sharing with you and that those were interesting. I hope that people on the panel got to enjoy at least some coffee as well. So if we could sort of maybe start off with the how. You maybe heard in the what about how we need to do central scenario planning. We need to think more about interconnections. We need to take into account all of this grid package substance that is currently on the table. But how do we actually go about this and maybe achieve some of the topics that were raised about speed, resilience? How do we factor those into what we want to do here? So maybe, to start off, first of all, Maxime, you represent the Belgian Federal Commission for Electricity and Gas Regulation. Thank you very much for joining us. Maybe talk about the how for a little bit and what you see as the process to achieving the various objectives that we've set for ourselves, the opportunities that we want to unlock. What does the journey actually look like from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if that works. Thank you. Also thank you to Agora for organizing that event. It's really fantastic to be able to discuss such important topics today with all of you. So maybe I would like to, first of all, emphasize, in my view, the need to maintain but also to strengthen the role of national regulatory authorities, because we are here to make sure that the system is properly developed, that also the consumers pay the right price for both for the energy but also for the infrastructure that is developed, and I think this is quite important. Now, you just asked the question, how do we implement a new approach? How do we do that? And I think that we can somehow split that question in different parts, different teams. And I would suggest to tackle these somehow separately. Being first the planning phase, the build-out of the infrastructure, but also the financing. And I think that these three topics are somehow also tackled and handled by the grids package put forward by the European Commission. Maybe first about the planning. Well, we already touched upon a little bit on that beginning of the afternoon, but I strongly believe that we should certainly strive for a better alignment in the planning of the system, both in terms of infrastructure, transport infrastructure, but also in terms of generation and production mix. And I think this also builds upon somehow on the study that was developed by Agora Energiewende, but also on proposition of the European Commission to go for a central scenario in the case package. Still, it is certainly important that we can align somehow on the system that we want in the future, that we do that also collectively to be able to reach the optimum. But on the other side, these scenarios must also, or the elaboration of the scenario must also include the national authorities, the member states, because it is good to develop a scenario, but most of the policy decisions regarding the production mix, namely, but more generally on the energy sector, energy policy, is also made at national level. So we shall certainly not forget that. And maybe on top of that, we mentioned a central scenario, but it is, in my view, also very important to develop sensitivities on these scenarios to make sure that we can somehow test case the different results that we will obtain based on these scenarios. Maybe second, build out of the infrastructure. There we must certainly ensure that the needs that are identified are effectively developed in terms of infrastructure. And we are here definitely for that as a regulator. Now, we saw coming in grids package the proposal of the Commission to go for a needs matching process, which is a new process that would be led by the Commission to somehow tender new grid investments that would not otherwise be developed. I fully understand the goal, certainly. Still, there are some questions, in my view, on how we implement that, because such a needs matching process would need to be based on real needs. We cannot just develop some simplified models, come to the identification of some potential project and then directly go to tendering them. We also need some kind of very thorough assessment and expertise in this process. And again, I think that national authorities definitely have a role to play. Also linked with the national development plans. Financing. Well, financing is a core competence of the regulators with the tariff that are also checked and approved by regulators. In my view, it works quite well. We did not see any specific proposition on that from the grids package, but still other propositions related to financing in terms of cross-border cost allocation, also in terms of ring fencing of congestion income. These are tools that could be employed, but of course still to be checked case by case if this is relevant. And well, that is.
Thank you, Maxime,
for me.
For the first intervention there about how how we go about how-in here, to be very ungrammatically correct, but that is what we're trying to get into here. Robert, over to you now. We had one sort of like national perspective here from the Belgian side, but also obviously broader across borders. Do you share kind of all of those views? Is there anything additional you would add about how we do this? Obviously national sensitivities, that was one of the things I sort of took from your comments there, Maxime. What else do we need to take into account here, Robert?
I will jump on this national part because as a TSO we are very conservative about looking on the prospects, how the systems will evolve under the new assumptions. Actually, we are always in this triangle in which we have politicians on the national level, European Commission, and TSOs, so this engineering vision. And this tension inside this triangle is pushing this debate about the future of energy market, energy system forwards. And I think that, you know, in a grid package, we have a lot of good propositions about permitting, a lot of stuff that needs to be a little bit clarified, like central plan. But I think the most important question here is where are we heading, like with all this process? Do we need a central operator? Do we need to go on in this process of centralizing, thinking, modeling, planning into maybe one body? In Agora Energiewende reports, we had also a proposition to create something like NISO, so the British, new British operator on the national levels. So there are a lot of propositions how we can deal with the problems we're facing, but I think we're missing one point. We're missing the point where we're still in a situation where the national states are responsible for the energy policies, and this leads us to the situation when every capital, every state looks on their energy mix, on their energy sector from different perspective, because the mixes are different, but from one common position, that their responsibility in front of their citizens for what is happening inside their system. So if Spain and Portugal last year had a blackout, Spanish people's Portuguese citizens are not blaming German engineers in the control rooms, they are not blaming Brussels clerks, they are blaming Red Electrica, their government, or utilities, for not handling the situation properly. And from this perspective, it is really hard to push this way of thinking that we can centralize something and solve all the problems, because it's in Brussels there is a tendency to see through this lens that if we have a problem, let's centralize it and maybe we can find a solution, some common ground. And I think that the first thing that we need to do is to think about this. So how we adapt to these new circumstances we are facing, and how we treat as a nation state, as a European Union, our responsibilities inside our electricity sectors. So I think that, you know, Polish perspective is Eastern European. We are everything for us is about the security. We are facing the threat from the east. We are thinking about the critical infrastructure on so many levels of redundancy that you don't want to know. And it creates costs. And from the perspective of Brussels and some efficiency excels, this cost is a burden. Why do you have it? But from our perspective, is the thinking is more simple. That if we don't have this line, or if we don't build this part of the infrastructure or buy additional transformer, we're gonna face a serious problem when some, you know, unknown drone will hit our critical infrastructure or something like this. So there are clear boundaries of thinking how we can integrate and centralize our modelings, our central planning, and so on. Having said that, I just want to emphasize that from our perspective, it is really important to make things transparent. So as a Polish TSO, we want to push harder with going with the data to the markets, to talk more to the markets, to also to find more cooperation with our neighbor friends in regions, in our region. The very important part of this discussions are interconnectors, and in the previous panel we had a lot about this. For the last 10 years, we increased our capacity of interconnectors 6 times, so from 1 to 6 gigawatts. It's still not enough from the perspective of some European targets, but we have plans to expand it more. However, the question is that how to look at this case. So we can look on this case from the perspective of additional energy bridges, interconnectors, But if you ask engineers, it's sometimes easier to upgrade internal grids inside the country to get the better effect, to get more electricity from abroad or export more. So that's basically our case. So this discussion is, from my perspective, really hard. I'm not an engineer. I was analyst for 12 years before I joined TSO, so I'm not rotten yet. Conservative viewpoints, and I mean it, that there is many people in my organization who still don't imagine a situation when we don't have spinning mass inside our electricity system. And we have clear examples that this is the way. But the thing is that we need to find a solution in this triangle, and we need to find a solution how we treat electricity and the transformation from the perspective of member states. And maybe then we can go forward faster with the reforms presented in the grid package. I'm optimistic about this prospect. However, the second crisis, which we are observing now in the Strait of Hormuz, will probably give us another huge injection of energy in terms of thinking that this is the moment and we don't have other way. So that's why I'm optimistic. Yeah.
On the Polish interconnection point, I mean, one of my favorite stories from the last 12 months was obviously the Baltic grids synchronizing with continental Europe, which was made possible by Poland's interconnection rate increasing, right? So I think...
Absolutely. Just one short story about this, because exactly our place in the electricity markets changed. We synchronized in the first days of war together with our help from our neighbors from Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, Ukraine, and Moldova. And last year we synchronized Baltic states. But this is also the story about how far we can go with thinking about, for example, new interconnectors. And we were tempted to join Bornholm Energy project, which is the offshore project between TSOs from Denmark and 50 Hertz. And we refused, not because we don't want to have cheap electricity from the offshore, but because our grids in the northern Poland are so underdeveloped that if we would build this interconnector and connect to the Bornholm Energy Island, we would basically kill our capacity that we want to build in the northern Poland, so offshore, and we're planning 18 gigawatts of offshore there, and nuclear power plant. So it would be so costly that there will be no way to build it with this interconnector. So this is the parts and the example how tricky the debate about the interconnectors could be. And there is like no easy solutions to save the capacity on your side and to get cheaper electricity also in the same way. So yeah.
A reminder of how complex all of this is, even though we want to make it simple, obviously. Pamela, moving to you now, Vice Chair of the Green Industrial Grids Association. Yeah, I mean, give us your sort of perspective on this, sort of like, obviously two member state-ish kind of views there but obviously how that interacts with other countries, but maybe like the bigger picture of this, and maybe you could pick up on the centralization point that Robert picked up on as well, where you stand on that. Yeah, how do we do this?
Thanks so much.
If you could, as close to your face as possible as well without touching.
Is it on? Perfect. I think maybe I should introduce GIGA, our Green Industrial Grids Association. It's a new association that represents large energy users that are operating in Europe. We're currently made up of transportation electrification, we have metals, we have data centers, and technology providers. And we're also looking to expand to new memberships. A lot was talked about how do you grow demand in Europe. And one of the previous speakers mentioned that we're now less in demand than we have been since 2019. However, we have electrification targets, we have industrial growth targets. A lot of people have been discussing how do we attract lower prices and use the system in a more efficient way to ensure there's security that was mentioned previously, as well as the prices to attract investment. However, as our members, our demand users, I can say the biggest barrier for us is actually getting a connection date. And having a timely access to power is the single biggest barrier. And so I'm actually going to walk you through what it looks like from demand users' perspective to get power, and then actually present some implementable solutions that regulators can look at and member states when you're looking at how to scale fast. So let's say you're a developer of a charging infrastructure, school buses, for example. You want to see where you should be siting your charging infrastructure. We need to have access to where there is available capacity on the grid, and that's where transparency is really important. Having real visibility as to where there's currently capacity on the system that we can put new projects in line. That comes with the second problem. If you have a lot of transparency, which is amazing for people to be able to see where you can invest in the right way to be good citizens of the grid, because capacity is a scarce resource, there is a lot of speculation, and we'll call it capacity grabbing, where people will put a project application in that isn't necessarily real to hold the capacity to sell off to somebody else, which a lot of our members are facing quite regularly. And so that's why we were really excited to see the connection reform recommendations that were in the grids package that switched from a first in, first out, but actually readiness-based approach, because then you're able to weed out some of those speculators that are holding capacity and preventing growth and electrification that's needed. The other thing when I think about how we're getting a connection date, so we apply for the connection, they say it's going to take 7-10 years in many areas. There's avoiding the speculation, there's the reforms themselves, but there's also ways with which you can improve the connection process to get there faster. And that's through things like digitalizing the application process, leveraging ML and AI tools to be able to look at the grid impact studies. You can actually decrease it from months down to hours, which is really helpful from a labor and resource perspective for a lot of utilities. And then we have this connection date. It's 7 to 10 years. We want to put our electric school bus on the line faster. So how do we maximize the existing capacity that you have on the grid? And that's through leveraging things like grid-enhancing technologies, looking at TOTEX approach investments, where you're actually looking at maximizing the existing capacity, or having performance-based mechanisms for utilities so that they can maximize the capacity. And then there's other things like allowing flexible connection agreements, so having people be able to have not just firm power, but some non-firm power, which are being explored by a number of demographics. Planning was mentioned by everyone, and I think that industrial players play a big role, because if you're going to build the system for them, you should actually know where they're planning on building. I think there needs to be some sort of a platform for industrial players easily, in a non-binding way, to share their load projections in a way that's commercially sensitive. And that's something that at Giga we've been pushing quite aggressively with the Commission and with the NRAs as well, to find ways to do that. The other thing we talked about is, how do you invest faster? Somebody mentioned earlier anticipatory grid investment and looking at industrial zones, and I think that's really important if you're working directly with the stakeholders, because you'd like to avoid stranded assets. It's quite expensive to deliver the grid. The other thing would be to actually have competition in the delivery of the system. So that would be allowing third parties to invest in the system or scale it back. They have in the UK the IDNO program. That's something that you could look at the TSO level as well. And then obviously, if you want to invest faster, you need to fix some of the other problems that are happening on the ground. That's permitting, which I think is great for cross-border, but it's within the member states themselves as well. Permitting is a huge barrier in a lot of member states. And then finally, which hasn't been mentioned today, is how do we solve some of the supply chain blocks that are coming, and the labor blocks? Like, how do we resource so that we have the right types of staff to be able to build the system we need on the ground? I don't know how to solve that, but somebody else.
Identifying the problem is often 50% of the challenge, right? Good citizens of the grid. I like that one, Pamela, as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned that when we talk about going faster, it isn't just about how do we get spades in the ground faster investments as well. I think that's often a part of this debate that's sometimes lost. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the grids package today, which is obviously a European Union initiative. But Paul, you're here from GB's National Energy System Operator, NESO. But that doesn't mean that your perspective here is not totally invaluable, because we are talking about how to implement a new approach, which doesn't just mean the grids package. And obviously, GB has had a lot of success in the energy transition, and there's been a reason for that. So yeah, maybe share your view on how do we implement a new approach, and the how-to guide, the 101, the how to do it for dummies kind of points,
Excellent. Thank you, Sam, and thank you to the organisers for inviting NESO to take part in this event today. Firstly, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. So if you were expecting that, I'm not.
Ignored the question straight away.
I'm very happy to share the experience that we have in Great Britain and the transition that we are going through in terms of the structure of our industry, and then also in the overall energy transition. So you've referred already there to NESO as the new independent system operator and planner for Great Britain. And we're set 3 primary objectives. These will be familiar. Decarbonisation of our energy system, ensuring it's safe and reliable, and ensuring that it's affordable and an enabler of economic growth. And even though we've left the European Union, we are still very much part of the European energy system. We have 10 active electricity interconnectors, which at this moment are supplying 8.2% of Great Britain's electricity. But just to highlight the transit point, we're actually exporting electricity back to Denmark and the Netherlands, whilst importing it in Britain from Belgium, France, and Norway today. And one of the reasons that NESO was set up in Britain as the independent system operator and planner was to recognise some of the things we've heard today, to recognise that solving the energy challenges of the future don't come from looking at the electricity system in isolation to the hydrogen system, that need a longer-term view of things, and sometimes a view that is away from parties that are part of that. So we've been set up as an independent company, so we're independent of government, but we're also independent of any other company in the energy industry. We don't own any assets, we don't own the wires and cables and pipes. We don't own any generators or storage facilities. We are just the independent system operator and planner. But importantly, we do that for gas, hydrogen, and electricity. And the things that we're doing now are implementing some of those centralized energy and network planning, but doing that in a way that is more transparent, in considering more a diverse range of factors than we used to. So moving away from just economic to thinking about environment, community, land use, and the marine environment, and bringing our communities and our citizens along on that journey as they are both the recipients of an energy system, but also in part host that system in their communities. We're also tackling the connections queue. You mentioned it here. I think our connections queue alone in Great Britain got to 600 gigawatts of generation wanting to connect. We're now partway through that journey of aligning that queue to projects that are ready and strategically aligned to where we need. And we're now thinking about what comes next in terms of demand. So strategic demand, electrolyzers, decarbonised industries, and real growth areas around data centres. And again, we also share the challenges of skills and supply chain in Great Britain, as everywhere does. So I very much look forward to sharing more of my perspective as we go through the conversation this afternoon. But
fantastic.
Already some things that resonate here, and I'm happy to talk about how we've approached that.
Thank you, Paul. Before we get further into the discussion, the same drill as the first panel, of course. If any of you in the room have any questions, get them in your mind, and there'll be an opportunity at the end. And anyone online in the cyberspace, the same. My colleagues will be able to distribute them to the panel as well. And we will also have a poll run in, which again will appear magically behind me. Amazing. How have you voted already? I haven't asked you the question. So yeah, how do we better align all of this planning with infrastructure development? Should it be through strengthening the mandate of the national regulatory authorities, creating a European planning entity, for example, more of that sort of centralization that we were talking about, improving coordination, sort of similar to the strengthening the mandate, I suppose, but slightly more nuanced, or the easy option, all of them, which I see 3 of you have taken already. There's no wrong answers, but whichever one of them you think is more important, we'll go over the results at the end. So scan the QR code and get voting. Otherwise, back to this discussion, maybe for the 2 of you, first of all, Pamela outlined a great sort of like checklist there of things that we can actually do practically in reality, large language models for applications, so on and so forth, some really great ideas. Do those sort of resonate with you as things that are actually happening or things that are being ignored? Could be more effort put into it? What's your experience of these kind of practical things in reality? Maybe you said first, so you can go first, Maxim.
Thank you. So yes, of course, this resonates quite a lot with our experience in Belgium as a regulator. You mentioned namely the connection queues and difficulty to access new capacity, network capacity. This is certainly something this is on top of our list and action points that we are currently taking for the moment. Because I believe that Belgium is not the only member state which is facing such an issue. And the thing is that if a company cannot access additional capacity to the network, then definitely it can also not expand to further develop its own activities. It can eventually also not electrify. And this is, of course, very critical for the energy transition. So indeed, this is certainly something that we are facing today and that we are tackling, of course. You mentioned specifically the queues and the way we shall manage the different demands which are introduced. And to this end, we also reviewed very recently the way we work, also based on different guidances of the European Commission. You mentioned growing demand. Of course, growing demand. Now, in Belgium, we are somehow facing different things. At the same time, growing demand, at the same time, difficulties to access new capacity. Also, we see a general trend towards a growing demand, which we need to take into account also in network planning. But this brings us somehow to some challenges because structurally the demand will evolve, but we are not observing yet a strong increase in that demand. And so this is somehow also a bit difficult because we need to prepare the infrastructure in the long term to be able to cope with that demand, with the electrification, with the energy transition. But at the same time, the volumes are not evolving that fast, and this translates into higher tariffs because the new investments are then covered also by somehow more or less the same amount of energy. And so this brings us also to another point you made, tariffs. This is certainly something that we shall keep under control, because if you make the electricity bill not affordable, both for companies and for households, then somehow you will also slow down the electrification and transition. And TOTEX approach, of course, TOTEX approach is certainly something that is very crucial and critical because we have existing infrastructure. We need to develop more also to be able to connect additional uses and users. But we also need to maximize the use of our existing infrastructure to somehow keep the cost under control. And to that end, TOTEX approach is certainly one of the solutions. In some cases, to prioritize eventually non-wire solutions when that would prove to be efficient and relevant.
Yes, so I will start from the permitting reform also. So I think this is the most important topic here. I was in this survey after the first panel in the column with permitting. So Paul said that you in GB have more than 600 gigawatts of capacity waiting in the queue. You had, yeah, it dropped from that. So we have now, so we are in the middle of the reform. We're waiting for the decision of our president if he's going to approve the reform that's passed through the parliaments, the permitting reform. So now we are sitting on 250 gigawatts waiting capacity, waiting in a queue to be connected, and it is absolutely impossible from our perspective to effectively plan the grid with so much projects, which in huge amounts are zombie projects, which we are sure that won't be realized. So this reform is crucial, and we see also in the grids package that it's emphasizing to go on with this. But this is the first step. This is absolutely the first step, because with the new principle, first ready, first served, we can finally be able to estimate how much new lines we need, how much the old infrastructure we can utilize to the maximum efficiency level, and not to build the new one. So this is also our top priority. Speaking about the demands, of course, the process of electrification will speed up in the coming years. We are seeing in our forecast that in the next 15 years, our electricity demands in Poland will grow around 50%, so from 170 terawatt hours to around 264. So that's a huge jump. From our perspective, the biggest problem and the biggest challenge is the geography, that our system is creeping to the north, because we historically have our base capacity in the south, in the Silesia region, where we have our mines. And now we're building new infrastructure, offshore, nuclear in the north. So we need new grids. We are also in a constant conversation with business, like data centers, and trying to convince them to locate their facilities in the north, because look, there will be more capacity there, but they don't want to. They want to locate where they have the best telecommunication cables, the fastest internet connection, and the biggest amount of educated people after universities that they can employ. So this is huge challenge, to move these demands to the places where we're going to have the capacity. So we will have less congestion, and we're going to have less. We will be able to spend less money to have this infrastructure. The last remark, I think that these challenges are quite familiar across the Europe, but we, talking on this technocratic level, sometimes forget about like the common folk, I would name it like this. We are in the process of the electrification is speeding up. We have more and more decarbonized energy mixes, but we're sometimes forgetting that this process might divide our societies into the winners and losers. So the winners, I mean, like prosumers who have their own electricity produced from the rooftops, photovoltaic panels, and people in the block of flats that cannot have, from the financial reasons or other, this kind of infrastructure. So this is very important social dimension, which we cannot drop when we talk and have this kind of debate about the future of the grids and whole the electricity sector, because otherwise it will be very catastrophic for whole the process. So yeah, I will point here.
Pamela, Robert mentioned there about how that conversation with data center builders, for example, is going on about trying to cajole them into building it where it's most effective, perhaps. And you mentioned there about how there's no point not involving industry because we're doing this partly to benefit them and to keep a competitive industry in Europe. What does the best kind of forum and how do you bring both of these people together? Is it just through associations like yours? How is the best way to actually get these viewpoints across without, too many cooks spoil the broth kind of dynamic where obviously industry doesn't have one point of view, you have many different point of views, different, requirements. So how do you see that dynamic evolving most effectively, I suppose, as we do this planning?
Well, I think there's a number of ways that you can gather information from industry. I think the first thing is having forums like this, but also having working groups within the utilities where you can bring different industries to the table when you're talking about planning or a strategic demand. And I know NISO has been having a lot of those, which have been quite productive. Something that I mentioned that I think is going to be really important that I haven't seen happen yet is to have a way for industries to actually share their long-term load projections in a way that's anonymized to protect their commercial sensitivity. I think that's going to be helpful to validate the centralized plan, but also to help grid operators to identify where the investments are going to be needed. Some of the conversations that I mentioned with NISO and with other utilities that our members have had are really kind of talking about where we're going to be locating, but also educating on some of the operational constraints that we're facing that doesn't allow us to put our data centers in the north or our charging infrastructure 300 miles away from the vehicle that we need to charge it. So there's also you need to look at the fundamental business constraint that you're trying to fix and working together to try to solve that in a way that's economically efficient, as well as bringing to scale and ensuring the system is reliable, I think is going to be really important.
It complements that point, I guess, from the first panel about, open source, transparency, making sure the data is available to those who need it, hopefully. Paul, kind of like on the geographical point that maybe Robert pointed out as well, where obviously every country deals with this. The UK is not excluded from that. Windy Scotland, demand down south. How have you dealt with that? How are you dealing with that? I know it isn't an issue that's been solved. It hasn't been solved anywhere. But is there any kind of, tips that can be perhaps replicated in Poland, in Germany, in Italy, where this geographical point is also a consideration?
Yes, and it is. It's a very good point, and there's some wry smiles from those who know the GB system well. We have some significant congestion constraints, we call it, between Scotland and England and Wales, and that is primarily driven by two factors. One, we've connected a huge amount of renewable generation to the network, particularly onshore wind in Scotland, where it's A, very windy, B, there are not a huge number of people there, so there is an availability of good land that is suitable for that type of technology. So driven partly, as I say, by the generation connecting, but then partly, secondly, by the internal grid infrastructure lagging behind the need. And I think there's a few themes I will pick up in there. Actually, you can trace back more than a decade ago when we said, as our predecessor organisation, the electricity system operator, we need some pretty hefty reinforcements north to south in Great Britain. And we need them in the early part of the 2020s. It's now gone past the early part of the year 2020s, and we're expecting them at the end of the decade. But actually what happened since the middle part of the 2010s is that our government target and international ambition around decarbonisation goes up and up and up. So every year we would plan, which is the first step, you've got to do some planning. But we would usually find that we were then behind the curve because the plan changed. We joked for a while that one of our former prime ministers would go to his country retreat in Chequers every weekend and come back with a new offshore wind target, Boris Johnson. It did. It went from 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to 40 to 50 in relatively quick succession. We went from an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 to 100% to a net zero system. So, but we've lagged behind that. But what's also happened is the infrastructure that has been signalled has not been delivered at the pace it was needed. And if some of that infrastructure that we'd signalled 10 years ago had been built when we'd said it would be needed, we would have fewer constraints now, fewer congestion. So there is an element, I think, that the sort of the learning in there is a plan is great, but actually what we tended to find is people were uncertain about the plan and unsure if it was going to happen, when in reality, we actually kept outpacing it. But the worry at a sort of regulatory perspective was, well, what if we undercook it and we end up with stranded assets? So I think it's that cautionary tale of doing nothing is a choice. That has a cost to consumers and a cost of carbon that we need to be cognizant of. My other reflection in this space is Great Britain, and indeed a lot of Europe, has decarbonised as it has, not because it's built lots of grid in the last 20 or 20 years, but because it has been able to adapt the amazing grids that it inherited from the 1960s and 70s. But there comes a point where you just need to build some more.
Are there any online questions already we could go to? I think that would be a good time. Yeah, yes. Who are they from? What do they want,
there are,
to talk to?
In fact, 2 questions to Paul. The first is if you could expand a bit on the reasoning behind the decision to implement an ISOP and how NESO was actually implemented.
Yeah, so it was so if I take you back through a little potted history, that might help. So, because we like to do everything in a slightly confusing way in Great Britain, we've had 3 transmission owners, 2 in Scotland and 1 covering England and Wales. And they were TSOs in the European sense, apart from the largest of those, National Grid, operated the whole country. In fact, if you go back to before 2000, it didn't, and Scotland was operated separately. So we've got this system of three TOs, and actually all the offshore network is owned by different companies. But the electricity system operator was operating the system on behalf of the country and doing some of the planning. There was a perception that the company that was building the network shouldn't be making decisions about which network needs to be built. The argument was, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So it was decided in 2019 that we became a legally separate part of National Grid Group. So we were entirely ring-fenced, although still owned by National Grid. We became National Grid Electricity System Operator. And then we operated like that for a few years. And then there was sort of, well, maybe we could go the whole hog. Maybe we could go the rest of the way and complete the sort of independence journey. But in doing that, we took that core function of National Grid ESO in terms of the planning and the operating of the electricity transmission system, and added to that the cross-sectoral view around gas strategic planning and then hydrogen strategic planning as well. And then we also gained additional responsibilities around the overall resilience and emergency management of the system. So I think that's the journey. It was increasingly over time separating those who build the assets from those who make the decisions about which assets you need, and then saying, actually, there is some cross-sectoral whole energy thinking that would help make that step even better and deliver better outcomes for consumers.
I think that answers the question quite comprehensively. In a good way. Is there any questions in the room that we could get to at this point? Or yes, if you could introduce yourself and also direct the question to somebody, if it's for somebody in particular.
Yeah, my name is Clara Bunches. I'm a trainee with the Commission in DG Ener, and my question kind of goes well, to most of you, I guess, because it was mentioned before that there's investment needed on the one hand, but on the other hand, affordability has to be guaranteed and consumers have to be thought about. So I was wondering, how do you think this gap kind of could be bridged, that consumers are not affected by the investments needed, and that they can still, that affordability for them is still assured?
Affordability. Who would like to come in on this one first? Anybody? Sure. So, Mike there.
So I would say that from the perspective of the TSO, so from the perspective of planning the infrastructure and thinking about the electricity market of the future, so we as a TSO, and we written this in our new strategy, need to have an equipment to count which mechanism, which tool will be more efficient from the perspective of the cost for the markets, for the end customer. So this is our the principle behind which we are trying to introduce a lot of programs which would give us those tools. And I'm talking about our main targets. So our main target in strategy is to maintain stable electricity system under the circumstances of the zero emission energy mix in next 10 years. So in 2035, we want to achieve this goal. And to achieve it, we need, for example, to expand our fleet of synchronous condensators. That's called like this equipment. So with them as a equipment or as a market product, we'll be able to count which way to stabilization of the system is the most efficient. Now we use only the one way. We can force our coal power plants into the must-run option, so they will give us the base load to maintain the stability of the system. So by this diversification of the products, we are looking for composition to make the price lower. And because we are coming from the assumption that we don't know everything, but we know something about the complexity of the system, we want to consult this very closely with the market. So from this equation, we want to get the numbers and choose the lowest one, so that people in the end will be able to pay the lowest possible electricity bill, of course, from the perspective of the operator. So this is the part of the affordability story from our perspective.
Any other views on this affordability?
Offer a couple of reflections. So I've already made the point that doing nothing is not the cheap option. When we've looked at options going out and costed our future energy scenarios, we find that doing nothing still costs as much as decarbonisation. And there is a role here to play for various organisations at national and supranational level about the narrative around the cost of energy and the transition and what it means. But I can make it very real and very stark. So about 4 weeks ago, I changed to a new time of use tariff at home. I have an electric vehicle, and I changed tariffs. And I was like, I've got this. I know how the electricity system works. Didn't account for Donald Trump. So I'll give you the prices in pounds, but they're relatively similar to euro cents these days. When it is not windy in Great Britain, my average electricity price is now running around 28, 29 pence per kilowatt hour. It was 20 before the Iran excursion. When the wind gets above around 15 gigawatts, that price comes down and down and down. So tomorrow it's windy at home, so it'll be about 14 pence, almost half. Last week I paid 2 pence per kilowatt hour when it was particularly windy. So for me, just that narrative that I can already see in my energy bills of more homegrown electricity, more interconnection with our neighbours, that helps to drive down the price, and we absolutely have to do that in a way that is fair and equitable for everybody, and we don't put the costs onto one type of consumer or another. But the cost of doing nothing isn't zero. The cost of doing something, if we get it right, can be transformational.
That cost of doing nothing, or cost of inaction, however you want to put it, Paul, is something I always tried to put into journalistic coverage, but struggled somewhat due to maybe lack of real-world examples or something. But I think as the energy transition goes forward, a very tangible one there as well, where I think it will be easier to demonstrate that, and business as usual will not be even an option. It won't be on the table. So I think the more examples like that we can point to, I think a lot of these questions do get rather easier to answer. Were there any other points on the affordability, Maxime?
Yeah, maybe rapidly on affordability. You mentioned that, of course, we need to invest, but still we need to keep the bill under control. To this end, I believe that we have to, of course, scrutinize always all the investments that we do and make sure that these are based on realistic assumptions, to not invest too early in time in something that we would only need in 50 years. But still, there is quite some uncertainty, and we have to play with that because we have no other choice. We will always have uncertainty with scenarios building, and it is impossible to predict the future. So anticipatory investments may be identified and may need to be developed. We must, of course, prevent that these anticipatory investments become stranded. But still we have to make them, and then we still need to manage the bill, and to that end there are, I believe, some kind of solutions or ideas, at least in the Commission guidance on anticipatory investments. Somehow we have mechanisms to cope with that, but I would first propose to scrutinize all the investment projects and to try to make it fit as much as possible in the existing tariffs and bill.
I'm increasingly of the opinion that anticipatory investments will become sort of an art form, that if you're good at doing it, your services will be very much in high demand. So we'll see how that goes. Pamela, did you have a point on this affordability as well?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to come back to one of the speakers talked about cost and the breakdown of what cost is. Levies and taxes, delivery of infrastructure, and supply costs. Actually, Paul made a really good point, and I'm glad he brings up the importance of doing nothing and what that actually does. It's never a good idea. It's very clear in all of the conversations that I've been having and all of us on this panel have been having is that we need to look at ways to pre-invest in the system, both to ensure that we're having the infrastructure available to drive down costs so that we can leverage that cheap, clean energy in the north. If we're using it in the south, there's not land for the types of industries that we want there, but we still want to have access to those resources. So we need to take into account planning in a way that looks long-term at all those factors. But then when you have anticipatory investment, there's risk. And I think that's where having partnerships and clear discussions with industry about where they're going to show up, and then making those investments in a way that de-risks it. And then having ways with which we could maybe have public-private partnerships to look at de-risking the cost. But ultimately, the levies in a lot of places, they're for things like CFDs, they're for curtailment costs, so how do we maximize the system? And I think that's where planning and building the infrastructure that we need to optimize it is where you need to go.
4 replies there to a question. Congratulations. Doesn't always happen. Were there any more questions in the room before I go back to cyberspace, maybe to see? Yes, over there, microphone. Your name and who your question is for, if you please.
Hi, thanks very much for the opportunity. My name is Zsuzsa Patu, I represent RAP, and I would like to test a few ideas with you. All of you, we heard about all kinds of problems, you know, ghost project in the connection queue, not being able to coordinate grid development with those users at the grid edge. So what do you think about auctioning existing capacities? How do you see it? Of course, it's not like this bakery against the other bakery, but maybe for large loads. What do you think about the option of doing less shallow cost sharing between users? So, for example, a data center being able to contribute to the cost of building not until just the connection point, but deeper reinforcement of the network. And what do you think about contestable build? So that it's not only DSOs and TSOs who could actually build the grid, but the grid users as well. Of course, in the UK, we have some experience with offshore grid. That reduces a risk very much for the grid users because they know that the grid will be ready by the time the project is ready at the edge of the grid. Thank you very much.
Some ideas there. Anybody have some initial thoughts? Pamela?
I could just mention it because a few of the things that you mentioned, I had already talked in my solutions. First one about like self-delivery or contestable works. Certainly in favor of third-party competition to be able to accelerate investment in a way, as long as we're protecting obviously cost and we're maintaining standards to ensure that the system is delivered in the same standard that it would have otherwise been done. On auctions, I'm a bit weary of auctions, to be fair, because that feels like it's switching instead of a readiness-based approach to a best-dressed approach. And ultimately, the TSOs and the grid operators have to be non-discriminatory when they're giving access to power. And so we want to make sure that when we're giving capacity, it's based on who's ready and the system needs as well, what you've done with strategic generation, but not who is going to be providing the best other services. And you talked about contributing to costs, customers contributing to cost for investment. I think there's a lot of opportunities for seeing how we can attract private investment in the system. One could be through the customer, it could be through bonds, and it could be through some of the partnerships that I mentioned. It really depends on the location, but it is an interesting idea that I think that many member states are exploring right now.
Any other thoughts on Susanna's ideas, Robert?
I can jump into the capacity auctions. We actually had this in the permitting reform in Poland, so it was a part of it. But after that, the dialogue with the ministry, there was a decision to narrow it to the version that we're going to have a pilot on some points in the grid for the auctions, and we're going to test this system. So from our perspective, we support it very much. We can fine-tune it, so that's I hear your argument that it can be discriminatory for some players, but we think that this is the right way to not only think about the grid capacity in some current point, but also about getting some dialogue with the investor about investing more in some particular area. So you're getting a very effective tool to do so. So we support it very much.
Maxime.
If I may. I find somehow the question very interesting because it also connects to some of the works we've been doing quite recently, more specifically about access capacity to the network. We recently introduced a reform which does really not go in the direction of auctioning capacity, but either in the other way around, because we introduced the concept of what we call swimming lanes. So we defined some kind of categories of users, of grid users, which somehow do not compete with each other, do not come in competition with each other. And so, for instance, we have a specific category for the batteries, a specific category for the data centers, and then categories both separated, but two separated categories. One for the industries and another one for the other users. Somehow the idea here is also to say, as you mentioned, that the TSO has to act in a non-discriminatory manner, But on the other side, we also have different use cases of the network. And the network, not everybody can put the same price for the same service, but still accessing the network is very much necessary. You cannot put, in my view, in competition, a household or a residential area with a battery park. Because eventually the battery park will be able to put a very high price on the capacity because there is an economic activity behind and a market for that. But still, it would not be acceptable on a social point of view to put them in competition with residential use cases. So I find that quite interesting, and this is maybe one idea that we are now testing in Belgium to be seen what would be the outcome of it. But I'm quite confident that it will be positive.
Excellent. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple of observations on your question. So competition, you rightly said that in Great Britain we've had forms of competition in network build for some time. So through the OFTO, offshore transmission owner regime, so the links to wind farms offshore are built by or owned by a different company to the onshore network. We also have independent distribution network operators, IDNOs, that help to connect new housing estates, new industrial estates, as well as actually increasingly we're seeing some generation options come through as well. We have a framework in place for what we call CATO. We'd love a four-letter acronym. Competitively appointed transmission owners. So this is designed to be the next iteration. And it's complicated. Adding in separable bits of the transmission network that you can say that belongs to one company and is built and maintained by them and the rest of it is somebody else's. This is why I think it works with IDNOs because it's the last mile, why it works with OFTOs because it's a separate radial link. We do still intend to, at some point, our regulator definitely thinks this is a good direction of travel. So watch this space. The other one around cost sharing and tariffs. As somebody who in a previous life used to set the tariffs for Great Britain, I can assure we've tried every iteration, I think, over time. We have tariffs that vary locationally. And I will get told from some people that they're too strong and some people that they're too weak. And there's always a constant charge for change for how do you get these to do the right thing. So there is things we can learn. There are probably things that we can evolve, but it needs to be taken as part of the whole energy system. How are we strategically planning? Are we thinking about things like growth zones that the government is talking around? So it wants AI in a certain place. Or if we do more strategic planning and say the generation goes in a certain place, is it then right to have a tariff that sort of penalizes them for following the signal you've given them? So tariffs are an interesting world, and I think there are 26 member states in the European Union these days. I used to know the answer to that. Sorry. If there are 26 member states, there are probably 27 different ways of doing tariffs. So.
Fantastic. 4 more great replies there to a question. Well done, audience members. We do have one last thing to take care of on this particular panel, and it's the result of the poll, which should appear here. Oh, wow. Improved coordination between national regulatory authorities and European planning is the significant winner there. So yeah, that's how you do it. A concrete answer there. Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you all of you for voting and sharing your views, and obviously thank you to the panel for sharing your views. I'm going to turn the floor over to Frauke now, who will, I think, endeavour to conclude what we've learned here somewhat, and maybe talk about where we go from here, perhaps. But otherwise, thank you to all 4 of you for your great answers. You went some way towards answering this question, which is ongoing, I think. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sam, and thanks a lot again for this very fascinating final panel as well. I'm conscious then that I'm the only thing to stand between you and the drinks, so I am not going to attempt a long summary. But I do want to mention three main takeaways, at least for me, from this full afternoon of, I think, fascinating discussions. And the first one is really infrastructure is, above all, not a cost, but a competitiveness strategy. And it is that because it enables the solutions, renewables, electrification, flexibility, that bring down costs, that enhance resilience and security, and that drive the transition. So I think that was a key takeaway, in particular from our why session. Then if we look at the what, a key takeaway was electricity grids are a core focus. It's hard to do too much, as long as we get them more or less in the right place. At the same time, we need to shift the focus away from gas grids, where there's still too much of a focus today, and have a very targeted approach when it comes to hydrogen. And we heard again also in the presentation from Mario how an integrated approach across sectors, across countries, can save Europe hundreds of billions. Again, it's the 560 billion number by 2050. If we take into account additional savings from backup capacity, then we go up to 750 billion. And then finally, how do we get there? I think the encouraging part was that a lot of the House seemed to be kind of common sense. Now, a lot of the House are also outlined in the grids package, and it's a question about going and doing it and implementing it. And then I think the second one is that business as usual is a choice as well, is a risk as well. And in the end of the day, it's also a question of stepping back at looking at the governance and the processes, looking at the functionality, because not moving may be even a higher risk than moving and making choices. So on that, I will leave you here with the substance and a lot to chew on, I hope also